have the honor now of introducing Mark Knauer. He's a graduate of the Iowa State University, where he received his Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture and his master's. He still wasn't satisfied with all the letters behind his name, so he acquired a PhD in animal breeding and genetics at North Carolina State University and a postdoctorate at the Institute for Pig Genetics in the Netherlands. Mark is presently the swine extension specialist at the North Carolina State University, focusing on genetics and production management. Mark's the proud papa of a 6-month-old baby girl, so now he has no spare time. But with his experience from the books, in the lab, and doing guest lectures to students, his real passion is the practical experience he has gained by working in the field, or in this case, in the barns. From the slat up, his knowledge is immeasurable. I know you will gain valuable, practical, useful information to use on your farm. Please help me welcoming Mark Knauer.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank the Wallenstein Feed and Supply yesterday for their great hospitality, and producer Ryan Martin for the opportunity to visit his 1,500 sow unit yesterday. When you work at a university, any day that you are able to get out on a farm into the real world is a good day. Just a little bit about my background. I grew up in southern Wisconsin, so about 800 kilometers west of here. My family had a 50 sow pure line operation, Hamps, Yorks, and Landrace. My dad, back in the 1980s and 1990s, made several trips to Ontario in search of breeding stock. At the time, Ontario was ahead of the US as far as selecting on performance data, selecting for percent lean, and my dad realized that. He brought several introductions back from Ontario, including from such producers as Bodman Farms, Sure Game, Jim Donaldson, and some others as well. And so with that, it's really an honor to be here today in such a progressive place. And to circle back, I actually had the chance to visit Ontario and look at pigs about 25, 30 years ago, so to come back is really kind of bittersweet. Thanks, Teresa, for that nice introduction. Focus at North Carolina State University is swine genetics and production management, 70% extension, 30% research appointment. So essentially I work to deliver educational programs to the producers of North Carolina State and work with those large production systems to conduct applied research. I've been there about 7 years, coming this summer. A few of the program areas I work in, on the left side of the screen there, work in the area of heat stress. Yesterday, touring through Ontario, I saw some cool cell pads on some broiler operations. In North Carolina, and broiler operations, sow gestation housing, and sow lactation, you'll commonly see cool cell pads, and we're looking to evaluate the impact of cool cell pads in finishing in the southeast there. Piglet quality, worked on the genetics of piglet quality as well as management factors to improve piglet quality, and we'll be talking some about that tomorrow in our troubleshooting reproductive issues session. We have the ability to have genetic selection research lines at North Carolina State, one of the few places that is possible in North Carolina. Currently have a selection line for reduced age of puberty, and another selection line we're looking to select for pigs that better utilize fiber. And then what we'll be talking about today is perhaps the biggest part of my program is sow body condition and gestation management. Outline for today, we're going to talk about how thin and fat sows reduce profitability for your operation. We're going to look at some objective body condition tools. What is ideal sow body condition? How do we define that? Then at the end, we're going to talk about preventing thin and fat sows and then summarize what we've talked about today. So on the left there is a sow that's quite thin, and if you look through the scientific literature, you're going to see that she has impaired reproduction. And she's also potentially going to have some well-being concerns. So those thin sows are going to have a lower farrowing rate and possibly a lower subsequent litter size as well. On the other side, the picture there on the right is an example of a fat sow. And fat sows, they really hit you twice. They hit you because you spent a lot of money and feed costs to get her to be fat, and then those sows also potentially have farrowing problems. But then we also have quite a bit of data showing that those fat sows have increased pre-weaning mortality. So they hit you twice as far as high feed costs, but then they also have poor reproduction. So we really want to avoid fat sows. Here's some data looking at thin sows in relation to impaired reproduction. So the graph here to set this up, the bottom axis is sow body condition score, 1 through 5, and the side axis is the percentage of sows in each category. And this was a large evaluation in the US looking at cull sows. Actually, some of these cull sows were at Canada that came down to Peoria, Illinois. And you can see sows that are thin or a body condition score of 1 at a much higher likelihood of having acyclic ovaries or ovaries that were not functioning. And so this is likely some of the underlying biology of why those thin sows have poor subsequent farrowing rate. Here's a study out of Belgium showing the association between sow body condition and colostrum, piglet colostrum intake. So to set this up, body condition across the bottom axis, thin, ideal, and fat, colostrum yield in kilograms on the side axis. And you can see from this Belgium study that sows that are over-conditioned produce less piglet colostrum, perhaps explaining why they have greater pre-weaning mortality. Here's some data from some of the trials we've done. Across the bottom is sow weight at breeding, and the side axis is number weaned. So each one of these dots on here represents a sow, and when we fit a line through these dots, we see a 100-pound or a 45-kilogram increase in sow weight, reduced pigs in this data set by 0.74 pigs. So now we'll take a look at some objective sow body condition tools. This is the sow body condition caliper. It was invented and developed at North Carolina State University and has been implemented across quite a few countries across the world. So the concept is quite simple, and this relates to all livestock species. So whether I have a dairy cow, a beef cow, a pig, or even a cat or a dog, the same basic principle applies. So if I have an animal that doesn't have a lot of fat and doesn't have a lot of muscle, if I look over the back of that animal, it's going to be very angular in its appearance. Now as that animal adds fat and muscle along its loin edge, the top of that shape changes and the animal is going to become wider and flatter across its back. And so what that caliper does is it's simply a crude tool that captures that angle of the back. The diagram on the right, that's actually taken from the Journal of Dairy Science. So I think the dairy industry is quite a bit ahead of us in body condition scoring, but I think with some new tools we're seeing on the swine side that we're kind of leaping past the dairy side. Here's the original drawings that I did at the kitchen table, putting together the original prototype. I just happened to live with my best friend at the time who just happened to be an engineer, who just happened to have the CAD tool that was able to draw up the prototypes for this technology. And so what is the sow body condition caliper? Well, it's not really a protractor, and it's not really a caliper. It's kind of a composite of the two. And so when we first came up with this technology, we didn't know how wide it needed to be, and we didn't know where we needed to place it on the sow to maximize the correlation between fat, weight, and muscle. And so we had to go through some initial testing to see how wide the caliper needed to be and where we needed to place it on the sow. Here is the sow body condition caliper, and so each one of the little markings there represents about a third of a body condition. And we'll show you how we came up with the thin, ideal, and fat labels here in a little bit. So basically we related it to subsequent reproduction, and so the ideal range there is where you should be able to keep sows and maximize reproduction. So that sets us up for the next graph here. So these are two farms within the same production system. They have the same genetics, feed comes from the same feed mill, same type of gestation housing. So across the bottom is caliper score. The side axis is percentage of sows in each category. So you can see that Farm A in black was doing pretty good. They had about 70% of sows in ideal body condition score. Farm B, they're overfeeding and they're quite fat. So as I said, these sows had the same genetics, feed came from the same feed mill, same type of facility. So what was the difference between these two sow farms? Anybody? Exactly. The people adjusting the feed drop boxes. And so this just shows that when we look at visual body condition, my score might differ from your score, might differ from your score. And here we kind of quantified this. And what the caliper will allow everybody within the same farm to get on the same page, and farms within the same production system to get on the same page. Other objective backfat and weight tools. On the upper left-hand corner there is just a Renco lean meter or A mode ultrasound. Frank, our technician there, is using a B mode ultrasound. That there is an Aloka 500. It's quite a big machine, but you can also get that in the smaller machines that you use for like pregnancy detection as well. Sow weight. How many farms in here would have a scale on their sow farm? Anybody? A few people. That's pretty rare though, as you can see, that most farms would not have a scale on their sow farm. So actually, when we captured data for our studies, we actually had to carry a scale in there. It was pretty labor intensive. The lower left-hand picture, heart girth is a very good indicator of weight if we want to capture weight. You can see there how many people capture heart girth and like their gilts. Several people throughout here. For those of you that use the weight tape, those weight tapes are sometimes challenging to use, right? Because they're pretty flexible. You can see the individual here in the lower left-hand corner, he's actually measuring heart girth of the tube, just a piece of water piping. And so we think for situations such as capturing gilt weight, that using that heart girth tube is going to be quite a bit easier for you versus trying to use a weight tape. Here's a study. We looked at labor requirements in relation to different technologies. The left picture, the young lady is palpating the backbone to conduct visual evaluation. The middle picture, she's using the caliper. In the right-hand picture, she's using the Renco lean meter. And what we found, as you may expect, is the sow caliper is going to probably take a little more labor than visual body condition. But both those technologies in relation to ultrasound backfat are going to save you quite a bit of labor. So what is ideal sow body condition? So we went through two studies to try to figure out what ideal sow body condition was in relation to subsequent reproductive performance. Study one was conducted at a commercial sow farm, 80,000 sow system in eastern North Carolina. We captured 1,500 multi-paired Paris white sows. Here's just a picture of Frank, our technician, and Miranda, the graduate student, collecting some of that data. Housing, sows were in stalls for 35 days of gestation, and then they went into small pens, about 4 to 5 sows per pen, until they farrowed. Partial slats there. So here's the optimal caliper score we found in relation to piglet survival. Across the bottom axis is sow caliper score. Side axis is piglet survival as a percentage, and you can see kind of a curvilinear response. We found an optimal body condition in relation to piglet survival. So keep in mind this curve, as we see a couple slides down, it basically describes what we found in relation to subsequent reproductive performance. Sows that were lighter weight had greater piglet survival. So if we go across the bottom axis, a sow weight at breeding in kilograms, side axis, piglet survival is a percentage. And so when we include parity and weight in the statistical model, it's really weight that's driving that piglet survival more than parity. So when you guys, producers, farmers I should say, look at your data, often you're going to see sows of higher parity have higher piglet survival, which is true, but that's really being driven more so by the sow weight, more so than actually what parity they are. So we had another production system in North Carolina that found out we were doing study A, and they wanted to do their own study as well. And so I designed the study for them. They collected the data, and then I analyzed the data for them and gave it back to them. Commercial sow farm, Eastern North Carolina, about 1,000 sow and gilts. Smithfield Premium Genetics. So different genetics, different nutrition, different gestation management than the first study. For this study, we looked at ultrasound backfat, sow caliper, farm body condition score, and captured heart birth on gilts. And we also took different time points. We measured animals right at breeding, we measured them at 35 days of gestation, and then we measured them just prior to farrowing. So we could look at gestation gain at different time points in relation to subsequent reproduction. And so when we put study A and study B together, again, these were different genetics, different nutrition, different gestation housing. We saw relatively the same answer. So to set these figures up across the bottom axis, again, is caliper score, and on the side axis is number weaned. And we can see a curvilinear response where we were able to identify an optimal body condition in relation to subsequent reproductive performance. So now we're going to talk just a little bit about preventing thin and fat sows. So in gestation, if you have a thin sow, we just simply increase feeding level. And if that sow doesn't respond, then she needs to be removed from the herd. So most of the sows that I've seen over the years that don't respond to increased feeding level have something wrong internally with them, such as an ulcer. In lactation, we want to make sure we prepare a sow in late gestation so she's not going to be thin going into lactation. So we want to be measuring her at the end of gestation to make sure she's in ideal body condition, or we're going to need to increase feed to make sure she's not thin going into the crate. If she's thin going into the crate and doesn't eat, that's a recipe for a very thin sow. And then once she's in the crate, we want to make sure, of course, she has good lactation feed intake, and look at our lactation length. You know, it could be a situation where you develop a threshold. If a sow falls below a certain caliper score, then you have to wean her early from lactation. So this has been shown before by a Canadian group, but it's a study we did as well. So if you increase feed at the end of gestation, you're going to have a better body condition when that sow is weaned. And also notice from day 100 of gestation on this graph to farrowing, you see a decrease in caliper score, about 1/3 of a body condition. So that last 2 weeks of gestation, that sow is pulling her resources to make sure she has plenty of resources for piglet birth weight and colostrum production. So again, preventing thin sows in lactation. If BCS falls below a certain threshold, you know, it may be quite wise to save the sow, wean her early. Preventing fat sows, prevention is key, because once a sow gets fat, it's pretty hard to get her thinned down. And so what happened if you messed up and your sow's fat? I'm going to show you some data here in a little bit that you don't want to try to fix it during gestation. Because if you get below that 1.4, 1.6 kilograms of feed in gestation per day, you're going to hurt birth weight. If you get below nutritional requirements in gestation, you're going to hurt piglet birth weight. And of course, we all know the importance of piglet birth weight. So if you have a fat sow, you definitely don't want to bump feed her or increase feeding level at the end of gestation. And perhaps it's going to take for her to go through a lactation cycle for her to get back into shape. So here is just a small pilot study we did. We had, so both these figures, the bottom axis is day of gestation. On the graph on the figure on the left is feed intake in pounds. And we fed these sows in gestation to try to thin them down. So we went below nutritional requirements to try to take condition off these sows, and we weren't able to do it. So for the BCS4 sows there in the gray line on the left figure, we were down around 1.4 kilograms per day below nutritional requirements, and we were not able to thin them down. And the other thing I want to point out on the right figure, again, gestation day, on the bottom axis, caliper score, on the side axis, you can see from day 100 to day 114 of gestation, those sows are losing condition. So here's the impact of gestation feeding levels below requirements on birth weight. The figure here, the bottom axis is gestation feed intake per day, side axis is average piglet birth weight, and you can see below nutritional requirements impairs piglet birth weight. A 1 pound or about a ½ kilogram decrease in feed reduced birth weight by 0.3 pounds per piglet, or 150 grams. So in summary, thin and fat sows reduce profitability, and fat sows you're going to get hit twice, because you got hit on high feed costs and inferior subsequent reproductive performance. Prevention of fat sows is key. If a sow becomes thin, increase feeding level, and cull her if she doesn't respond to increased feed intake. Available body condition tools eliminate the excuse for sows not being in proper body condition. And the sow body condition caliper we've developed, it works and it's being adopted worldwide. It can be found in 21 countries and 24 states. And so that's all pretty much spread word of mouth, because there's no salesman on the road. It's all pretty much word of mouth as far as how this is spread. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and the opportunity, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you all have. Thank you. You know, we talked about if you get a thin sow in lactation, if she falls below a certain threshold, perhaps you need to wean her early and get her out of there to keep her from losing more excessive stores. But when you get her out, if she responds to increased feeding level, she's going to put muscle back on and fat back on. So I don't think, depending on the economic structure, but generally it's going to be profitable to keep that sow in the herd, because we know that better sow longevity is more profitable. So I would say try to get her into condition, and if she doesn't respond to an increased feeding level, then yes, you need to cull her, but if she responds to increased feeding level, she should still be able to be a productive sow. So, thank you. In short, it depends. So, and you kind of got to categorize what your goals are. So if you want to increase piglet birth weight, that's potential one strategy. If you want to increase piglet colostrum intake, that's potential another strategy as well. So if you look at the science, what we'll talk about tomorrow, bump feeding and gilts, it's consistently been shown to increase piglet birth weight. Consistently. Bump feeding and multi-pair sows, if you only bump feed them one gestation period, has been consistently shown to not work to increase piglet birth weight. But there is one large old study showing that if you continuously bump feed sows every parity, that you will increase piglet birth weight. So some low-hanging fruit is to repeat that 1989 study done by Cromwell. That's some low-hanging fruit to see, okay, if I bump feed sows every gestation period with modern diets, modern genetics, do I increase piglet birth weight? And then when it comes to colostrum intake, there's some evidence out there that bump feeding, a short bump, I don't think we have all the science, but I suspect generally people would bump at 90 days. And I don't think we have all the science done, but I think we can maybe go to a shorter bump from 100 to 114 days. But there is some evidence out there that bump feeding will increase colostrum production, but we probably need some more science still to put the economics behind that bump, especially on the multi-parity sows. So if you had to make recommendations today, I would say bump feeding, a short bump on gilts is probably going to pencil out. And a short bump on sows, I'm not sure we know the economics of it. But if you look at within multi-parity sows, those thin sows you definitely want to bump, because you want to make sure they're ideal body condition going into lactation. But those fat sows, you probably don't want to bump going into lactation. Then it's just we need some more science to figure out what to do with the ideal sows. A better quality diet. Again, I'll present some more data tomorrow on that. But we did 2 large colostrum intake studies last summer. and they were perhaps not designed as well as they should have been, but we learned a lot. We learned that if you're feeding 2 kilograms of gestation diet or 2 kilograms of lactation diet the last 2 weeks, that lactation diet doesn't give you any benefit. So you're just kind of burning however more expensive that lactation diet is, you're just kind of burning those dollars. So we suspect that you have to get to real high levels of feeding an improved diet at the end of gestation to see the improvement in piglet colostrum intake. But again, it's hard to make recommendations right now because we still need a little more science to know how long we need to feed that higher feeding level and whether that's going to pencil out. That's a good question. So how do we transition from gestation stalls to the pen situations and maintain proper body condition? I think there's some other talks that are going to focus more on that. But in short, if you're putting them in stalls from weaning to day 35 of gestation, you got 35 days to get those sows in shape. So you got 35 days to make sure you don't overfeed your fat sows, and you got 35 days to make sure you get your thin sows up to ideal body condition. So focus hard on that period. And then once you put them in pens, depending on your system, it's going to be potentially harder to adjust feed based on body condition, depending on what your loose housing system is. So you have them in shape by the time you put them in there. But then once they're in group housing, it's similar to stalled housing as far as you kind of got to find that sweet spot. You kind of got to, every system might be a little different. Find that sweet spot of where those sows aren't going to put on excess condition and they're not going to become under conditioned. So it's hard to give an exact feed amount because it could differ a little bit for each system depending on all the different factors. But good question.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Mark. That was very informative. So again, I'd like to thank Can-Arm Ag Systems for sponsoring this session, the first session of our day. And again, to thank all the conference sponsors that you see around here and in the foyer. Without their support, first off, the fee would be a little bit higher, as well as the quality of speakers. So we have the ability to get in people like Mark and Amy and all the other speakers because of all the sponsorship and of everyone else there. So our breakout sessions will begin at 11:20, and so you've had a bad day is at Queen Victoria, which is upstairs. Medications, the changing rules, is in suite 300, which is also upstairs. And then planning for capital, ready to build, is in the Windsor Club, and that's on this level. So we'd like to now take time to enjoy the refreshment break outside, sponsored by GSI Automated Production Systems in the foyer. And reminder, there's no coffee upstairs, so if you want a coffee for the conference, please bring one up with you. Thank you.